On July 20th, 1969, with the eyes of 600 million people on him, Neil Armstrong was about to become either the first man to land on the moon or the first man to die there. He was standing inside a fragile spacecraft called the Eagle, descending toward the lunar surface, when the onboard computer began screaming alarms that no one in the cabin understood. As the alarms sounded, Armstrong looked out his window and saw something that turned the situation from dangerous to nearly hopeless. The automatic guidance system, the system that was supposed to land the spacecraft safely, was flying the Eagle directly toward a crater surrounded by boulders the size of automobiles. To land there would mean destruction, and the fuel was running out. Armstrong had seconds to decide, and the decision he made in those seconds, the thing he did when his lunar module was moments from crashing into the moon, is one of the greatest demonstrations of human skill and nerve ever recorded. This is the story of the 12 most dangerous minutes in the history of spaceflight, and what one American test pilot did when the machine failed and only a human being could save the mission. July 20th, 1969. Just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Houston time, in orbit around the moon, two spacecraft separated from one another. One was the command module Columbia, in which astronaut Michael Collins would remain in lunar orbit. The other was the lunar module, call sign Eagle, carrying Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and it was about to attempt something no human being had ever done. It was going to descend to the surface of the moon and land. The Eagle was unlike any vehicle ever flown. It had been designed to operate only in the vacuum of space and the gravity of the moon, and it looked the part. It was an angular, spidery machine wrapped in gold and black foil, standing on 4 spindly legs, with no aerodynamic shape because it would never fly through air. Inside, the cabin was so small and so stripped of weight that Armstrong and Aldrin did not even have seats. They stood, harnessed in place, looking out through 2 small triangular windows. The vehicle was, in the words of the engineers who built it, the first true spacecraft, a machine that could exist nowhere but in space. And it was now carrying 2 men toward the most dangerous 12 minutes either of them would ever experience. At the start of the descent, everything proceeded according to plan. The Eagle's descent engine ignited, slowing the spacecraft from its orbital velocity and beginning the long fall toward the surface. Armstrong and Aldrin monitored their instruments, called out data to one another into Houston, and watched the gray lunar surface rise slowly toward them. In mission control in Houston, the flight controllers monitored the descent with an intensity that none of them had ever felt before. They had rehearsed this descent hundreds of times in simulations. They had prepared for every failure they could imagine. The room was silent, except for the calm exchange of technical data between the spacecraft and the ground. For the first minutes, the powered descent of Apollo 11 was proceeding exactly as it had in the simulations. What Armstrong and Aldrin did not know, as the Eagle fell toward the moon in those first calm minutes, was that this descent was about to diverge from every simulation they had ever flown. Within minutes, the spacecraft's computer would begin sounding alarms that the crew had never seen in training. The automatic landing system would carry them toward terrain that could destroy the spacecraft, and the fuel, the one resource they could not replace, would begin to run dangerously low while Armstrong searched for a place to set down. The descent that had begun so calmly was about to become the most harrowing 12 minutes in the history of human spaceflight, and the survival of the 2 men aboard the Eagle and the success of the entire effort that had brought them there would come to depend not on the machine, but on the judgment and the nerve of the man at the controls. To understand why the descent of Apollo 11 was the most dangerous phase of the entire mission, it is necessary to understand what made it different from everything that had come before. The launch from Earth, the journey to the moon, the entry into lunar orbit, all of these had been tested, at least in part, by the earlier Apollo missions. Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 had flown to the moon and back. Apollo 10 had even flown a lunar module down to within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface, a full dress rehearsal of everything except the final descent and landing. But no one had ever flown a lunar module all the way down to the surface of the moon. The final descent, the powered descent from orbit to landing, was the one major phase of the mission that had never been performed. Apollo 11 would do it for the first time, with human beings aboard, on another world. The descent was dangerous for reasons that were inherent to the physics of landing on the moon. The lunar module had to slow from orbital velocity, approximately 3,700 miles per hour, to zero, and it had to do so while descending from orbit to the surface, and it had to arrive at the surface moving slowly enough and vertically enough to land without tipping over or crashing. All of this had to be accomplished using a single rocket engine, the descent engine, burning a limited supply of fuel. There was no margin for a long search for a landing site, because every second of engine burn consumed fuel that could not be replaced, and when the fuel ran out, the spacecraft would fall. The descent was a race against the fuel supply, a controlled fall that had to end in a gentle landing before the propellant was exhausted. The lunar surface itself added another layer of danger. From orbit and from photographs, the engineers had selected what appeared to be a smooth, flat landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. But the resolution of the available photographs was limited, and the actual surface might contain hazards too small to have been seen from orbit, craters and boulders that could destroy a lunar module attempting to land on them. The crew would not be able to see the landing site clearly until they were close to it, and by then they would be committed to the descent, with limited fuel and limited time to react to whatever they found. The possibility that the chosen landing site might turn out to be strewn with hazards was a real one, and it was a possibility for which the only remedy was the skill of the pilot. The lunar module that would attempt this descent was one of the most remarkable machines ever built, and also one of the most fragile. To save weight, every component had been pared down to the minimum. The walls of the ascent stage, the part that would carry the astronauts back to orbit, were in places so thin that a careless boot could have punctured them. The vehicle could not support its own weight in Earth's gravity. It existed only for the moon. This fragility was the price of the weight savings required to make a lunar landing possible at all, and it meant that the lunar module had no ability to survive a hard landing. A crash, even a relatively gentle one, would destroy it. The descent had to be nearly perfect. Finally, the descent was dangerous because of the consequences of failure, which were absolute. If the lunar module crashed, Armstrong and Aldrin would die on the moon, and their deaths would be witnessed, in effect, by the entire world. If the descent had to be aborted, the mission would fail, and the enormous national effort that had carried the United States to this moment would fall short at the final step. And if the lunar module landed but was damaged, or landed in a position from which it could not take off again, the astronauts would be stranded on the moon with no possibility of rescue, left to die when their air ran out. President Nixon's staff had, in fact, prepared a speech to be delivered in the event that Armstrong and Aldrin became stranded on the lunar surface. The descent was the phase where all of these catastrophes became possible, the 12 minutes in which the triumph of the entire program could turn, in an instant, into its greatest tragedy. And it was about to become far more dangerous than anyone had planned. The man at the controls of the Eagle was, by the assessment of nearly everyone who worked with him, the ideal person to be in that position at that moment. Neil Armstrong was 38 years old in July 1969, a civilian test pilot whose calm under pressure had become legendary within the astronaut corps. He had flown combat missions in the Korean War, ejecting from a damaged aircraft on one occasion. He had become one of the most accomplished test pilots in the world, flying the X-15 rocket plane to the edge of space. And he had demonstrated, on 2 separate occasions before Apollo 11, a capacity for survival under extreme circumstances that bordered on the uncanny. The first occasion had come during the Gemini 8 mission in March 1966, which Armstrong commanded. After successfully performing the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit, The joined vehicles had begun to spin, faster and faster, as a thruster stuck in the open position. The spin accelerated until Armstrong and his crewmate were approaching the point of losing consciousness, at which the spacecraft would have broken apart and killed them. Armstrong, his vision beginning to blur, had diagnosed the problem, shut down the malfunctioning thruster system, and stabilized the spacecraft using the backup re-entry control thrusters, saving both their lives. It was a performance of extraordinary calm and skill under conditions that would have paralyzed most people, and it was the performance that, more than any other, marked Armstrong as a candidate to command the first lunar landing. The second occasion had come in May 1968, during training for the lunar landing itself. Armstrong was flying the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, an ungainly machine known as the Flying Bedstead, built to simulate the handling of a lunar module during landing. The vehicle malfunctioned, lost control, and began to fall. Armstrong ejected, and his parachute opened just in time to lower him safely to the ground, while the research vehicle crashed and exploded behind him. The ejection had come approximately 1 second before it would have been too late. Witnesses reported that Armstrong, having narrowly escaped death, simply walked back to his office and went on with his paperwork, his composure apparently undisturbed. The story became part of the Armstrong legend, the test pilot so cool that he could eject from an exploding aircraft and return to his desk without visible reaction. This was the man at the controls of the Eagle, and his temperament would prove decisive. The descent to the lunar surface would require, at its critical moment, exactly the combination of calm, judgment, and piloting skill that Armstrong had demonstrated throughout his career. Beside him stood Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, a man of a very different temperament, but formidable expertise. Aldrin held a doctorate from MIT, where he had written his thesis on orbital rendezvous, the technique of bringing two spacecraft together in orbit. His expertise had earned him the nickname Dr. Rendezvous within the astronaut corps. During the descent, Aldrin's role would be to monitor the spacecraft's systems and call out the critical data, the altitude and the velocity, while Armstrong focused on flying the vehicle. The two men formed a complementary pair, Armstrong the cool pilot, and Aldrin the analytical engineer. The machine they flew was controlled by a computer that, by the standards of the present day, was almost unimaginably primitive. The Apollo guidance computer was a marvel of its time, one of the first computers to use integrated circuits, and its development had helped to drive the early miniaturization of electronics. But its capabilities were minuscule by modern measures. It had approximately 70 kilobytes of memory, a tiny fraction of the memory in a modern pocket calculator, let alone a smartphone. It operated at a speed that a modern device would exceed by many thousands of times. And yet this small computer was responsible for navigating the lunar module to the surface of the moon, performing the calculations that guided the descent in real time. The astronauts interacted with it through a numerical keypad, entering commands as sequences of numbers, and it communicated back through a small display of glowing digits. The limitations of the computer were not merely a matter of speed and memory. The computer could only do so much work in a given period of time, and if it was asked to do more than it could handle, it would become overloaded. The designers had built in a system to manage this, a priority scheme that allowed the computer to shed less important tasks and focus on the most critical ones when it became overloaded, and to alert the crew with an alarm when this occurred. This overload protection system was a sophisticated piece of engineering for its time, and it would prove crucial during the descent of Apollo 11. But the crew had rarely encountered its alarms in training, and when those alarms began to sound during the actual descent, neither the astronauts nor most of Mission Control would immediately understand what they meant. The combination, then, was this. Two men, one a test pilot of legendary composure, and the other an analytical expert, standing in a fragile spacecraft that could exist only in space, guided by a computer with less capability than a modern toy, descending toward the surface of the moon to attempt a landing that had never been performed. The margins were thin in every dimension. The fuel was limited. The computer was at the edge of its capacity. The landing site might contain hazards invisible from orbit, and the consequences of any failure were absolute. Everything had been prepared as thoroughly as human beings could prepare it. And then, 3 minutes into the descent, the computer sounded an alarm that no one aboard the Eagle had ever seen. The descent had been underway for approximately 3 minutes, and the Eagle had descended to an altitude of roughly 33,000 feet above the lunar surface, when the computer display suddenly changed, and an alarm sounded in the cabin. A number appeared on the small glowing display, 1,202. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew what it meant. It was an alarm code they had encountered only rarely in their training, and its appearance now, in the middle of the most critical phase of the mission, was deeply alarming precisely because it was unexpected. The computer was telling them something was wrong, and they did not know what, and they did not know whether it meant they had to abort the landing. Armstrong's response captured the pressure of the moment. His voice, normally so calm, carried an unmistakable edge of tension as he keyed his microphone and spoke to Houston. "Program alarm," he said, and then, a moment later, with more urgency, "It's a 1,202. And then, the question that mattered, the question on which the mission now hung. "Give us a reading on the 1,202 program alarm." Armstrong was asking Houston to tell him what the alarm meant and whether he should continue or abort. He was flying a spacecraft toward the surface of the moon. The fuel was burning, the surface was rising toward him, and his computer was telling him something was wrong that he did not understand. He needed an answer, and he needed it immediately. The question landed in Mission Control in Houston, where it set off a chain of decision-making that would have to be completed in seconds. The descent was being monitored by a team of flight controllers, each responsible for a different aspect of the mission, all reporting to the flight director, Gene Kranz. The controller responsible for the guidance computer was a 26-year-old engineer named Steve Bales, who occupied the console position known as guidance, or Guido. When Armstrong's call about the 1,202 alarm came down from the moon, the responsibility for deciding whether the alarm required an abort fell, in the first instance, to Steve Bales. A 26-year-old engineer, sitting at a console in Houston, had to decide in seconds whether to allow the first lunar landing to continue or to order the astronauts to abort and return to orbit. Bales did not have to make the decision entirely alone. Behind him, in a back room of supporting engineers, sat a young computer specialist named Jack Garman, who had made it his business to understand the alarm codes of the Apollo guidance computer. In the days before the mission, Kranz had drilled his team relentlessly on every conceivable failure, and during one of those simulations, a similar computer alarm had appeared, and the team had made the wrong call, aborting a landing that could have continued. Kranz had demanded that they understand every alarm code thoroughly, so that they would never again abort unnecessarily, or, worse, continue when they should abort. Garman had responded by preparing a handwritten list of every alarm code and what it meant, and he had that list in front of him when the 1,202 alarm came down from the moon. Garman knew what the 1,202 alarm meant. It was an executive overflow alarm, an indication that the computer was being asked to do more work than it could complete in the time available. The computer was overloaded. But Garman also knew the crucial detail that made the difference between abort and continue. The computer's overload protection system was functioning exactly as designed. When overloaded, the computer was shedding its lower priority tasks, completing the critical guidance and navigation calculations, and restarting cleanly. The alarm was a symptom of a problem, but the problem was not fatal, because the computer was handling it correctly. As long as the alarms were intermittent, as long as the computer kept recovering and continuing to perform the essential calculations, the landing could proceed. Garman communicated this assessment to Bales. The alarm was acceptable. They could continue. Bales made the call. Over the communications loop, he spoke the words that allowed the first lunar landing to proceed. "We're go on that alarm." The decision passed up through the flight director to the capsule communicator, and the word went up to the moon. The mission would continue despite the alarm. It was a decision made in seconds, under the most extreme pressure imaginable, by a 26-year-old engineer relying on the preparation of a young computer specialist and his handwritten list of alarm codes. Had they made the wrong call, had they ordered an abort, the first lunar landing would have been called off at the threshold of success, and the entire effort would have fallen short. Had they wrongly continued in the face of a genuinely fatal alarm, they might have sent the astronauts to their deaths. They made the right call, and they made it in time, and the relentless preparation that Kranz had demanded was what made the right call possible. But the 1202 alarm was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning. As the Eagle continued its descent, the alarms continued to sound, 1202, and then 1201, another variant of the same overload condition. Each time the crew had to ask, and each time Houston had to confirm that they were go to continue. The descent was proceeding through a series of computer alarms that the crew had never trained for, each one requiring a split-second judgment about whether to continue or abort. And while Armstrong managed the alarms, the surface of the moon continued to rise toward him, and the moment was approaching when he would look out his window and see, with his own eyes, that the computer was carrying him toward disaster. The repeated alarms transformed the descent into an ordeal of sustained concentration, unlike anything the crew had experienced in training. After the first 1202 alarm, the computer continued to sound alarms throughout the remainder of the descent, sometimes 1202, sometimes the closely related 1201, each one an indication that the computer was again overloaded and shedding tasks to recover. Each alarm forced the same sequence. The crew noted the alarm, and Houston, having understood the situation, confirmed that they were go to continue. The capsule communicator, astronaut Charlie Duke, relayed the confirmations to the crew, his voice carrying the reassurance that Houston understood what was happening and that the descent could proceed. "Roger," Duke would say. "We're go on that alarm," and again when another sounded. "We're go, same type, we're go." The psychological demand this placed on the crew, and particularly on Armstrong, was immense. Flying the lunar module toward the surface required continuous attention. The vehicle was descending, slowing, pitching over as it approached the surface, and Armstrong had to monitor its trajectory, its attitude, and its fuel, while preparing for the final phase of the landing. The repeated alarms were an intrusion into this concentration, a recurring demand that he divert attention to assess whether the mission could continue. A pilot of lesser composure might have been rattled by the alarms, might have lost the thread of the descent while attending to the computer, might have allowed the unexpected crisis to disrupt the precise sequence of actions that the landing required. Armstrong did not. He absorbed the alarms, trusted Houston's assessments, and continued flying. The trust between the crew and mission control was the foundation that made this possible, and that trust had been built through years of training together. When Charlie Duke said, "We're go on that alarm," Armstrong and Aldrin accepted the judgment without hesitation, because they trusted the people on the ground and the preparation that stood behind them. They did not know in the moment the details of why the alarm was acceptable. They did not need to know. They needed only to trust that the people responsible for understanding the computer had understood it, and that the judgment to continue was sound. This trust was not blind. It was earned, the product of the thousands of hours that the crew and the flight controllers had spent training together, learning each other's capabilities, building the confidence that would allow split-second judgments to be accepted under the most extreme pressure. In mission control, the flight director Gene Kranz held the room together. Kranz was a former fighter pilot whose intensity and discipline had shaped the culture of mission control. He had drilled his team through countless simulations, demanding that they understand every system and every failure mode, refusing to accept anything less than total preparation. The relentless drilling had a purpose, and that purpose was being fulfilled now, in the real descent, as his controllers confronted a crisis that they had, in effect, already rehearsed. The 1,201 and 1,202 alarms had appeared in a simulation only weeks before the mission, and the team had initially mishandled them, calling an unnecessary abort. Kranz had used that failure to demand that they master the alarm codes completely. That mastery was now paying off. The team was confronting the alarms with the calm of people who had seen them before and knew what they meant. This is one of the most important and least appreciated aspects of the Apollo 11 landing. The drama of the descent is usually told as a story of individual heroism, and the individual heroism was real. But behind the heroism stood a system of preparation so thorough that it had anticipated the very crisis that occurred. The 1,202 alarm was not handled successfully by luck. It was handled successfully because Gene Kranz had demanded that his team understand the alarm codes, because Jack Garman had prepared his handwritten list, because Steve Bales had drilled the scenario, because the entire culture of mission control was built around the principle that thorough preparation was the foundation of success under pressure. The American space program had learned, through the failures of its early years, that preparation and discipline were what separated triumph from catastrophe, and that lesson was now being applied at the most critical moment in the program's history. As the descent continued through the alarms, the Eagle dropped lower, and the character of the flight began to change. The vehicle had been descending in a relatively automated mode, with the computer controlling the trajectory while the crew monitored. But as the spacecraft approached the surface, the moment was arriving when Armstrong would take a more active role, when he would look out the window to see the actual terrain toward which the computer was guiding them, and when his judgment as a pilot would become the decisive factor. The alarms had been a severe test, and the crew had passed it, with the help of Houston. But the alarms were, in a sense, a problem that the system was equipped to handle. The next problem would be one that only the man at the controls could solve. As the Eagle descended through 3,000 feet, then 2,000, then 1,000, Armstrong looked out his window at the landing site that the computer had selected, and he saw that he could not land there. As the Eagle descended below 2,000 feet, the automated guidance system pitched the spacecraft toward a more upright attitude, and for the first time, Armstrong was able to see clearly the patch of lunar surface toward which the computer was carrying him. What he saw was alarming. The computer was guiding the Eagle toward a landing in a region that was anything but the smooth, flat plain that the mission planners had hoped for. Directly ahead, at the point where the automated system intended to set the spacecraft down, lay a large crater, later estimated to be the size of a football field, and surrounding it and strewn across the approach was a field of boulders, some of them as large as automobiles, some reportedly as large as small houses. It was, in Armstrong's later description, a landing site that was not at all what he wanted. The situation Armstrong now confronted was the precise scenario that the planners had feared but could not fully prepare for. The landing site had been selected from orbital photographs, but those photographs had not been able to resolve hazards as small as boulders. The automated guidance system was performing exactly as designed, carrying the spacecraft to the predetermined coordinates with precision. The problem was that the predetermined coordinates, invisible in the planning photographs, turned out to be in the middle of a boulder field surrounding a substantial crater. The machine was doing its job perfectly, and its job was carrying the astronauts toward terrain that could destroy them. The consequences of attempting to land in the boulder field were not in doubt. The lunar module stood on 4 spindly legs, and it required a relatively flat, clear surface to land safely. To set down among boulders the size of automobiles would mean, at best, landing at a dangerous angle from which takeoff might be impossible, leaving the astronauts stranded. At worst, it would mean striking a boulder during the descent, tipping the spacecraft over, rupturing its fragile structure and killing both men. To land in a crater would be similarly catastrophic. The fragile lunar module could survive only a landing on a relatively level, clear patch of ground, and the patch of ground toward which the computer was guiding it was neither level nor clear. Armstrong could not allow the automated system to complete the landing it had planned. This was the moment that defined the entire descent, and it was a moment that no amount of automation could resolve. The computer could not see the boulders. It was navigating to coordinates, not to a safe landing spot. It had no way to recognize that those coordinates were dangerous, no way to look out the window and understand that the terrain ahead would destroy the spacecraft. Only a human being, looking out the window with the judgment of an experienced pilot, could recognize the danger and respond to it. The automated system, for all its sophistication, was about to fly the spacecraft into a hazard it could not perceive. The survival of the mission now depended on the one capability that the machine did not have, the capability of a human pilot to assess a situation in real time and to act on that assessment. Armstrong understood the situation immediately. He was a test pilot, and recognizing hazards and responding to them was the essence of his profession. He saw the boulder field and the crater. He understood that the automated landing would carry them into disaster, and he made the decision that the moment demanded. He would take manual control of the descent. He would override the automated system, fly the spacecraft himself, and find a safe place to land. It was a decision that the mission plan permitted but had not emphasized, a capability that had been built into the spacecraft as a contingency, but that no one had expected to be the decisive factor in the landing. Armstrong would use it now, because the alternative was to allow the machine to fly them into the boulders. The decision carried its own severe risks. Taking manual control meant that Armstrong would now be flying the lunar module toward the surface by hand, searching for a landing site, while the fuel continued to burn. Every second he spent searching for a safe place to land was a second of fuel consumed, fuel that could not be replaced, fuel that he would need to complete the landing. The automated system, whatever its flaws, would have brought the spacecraft down quickly, if into a dangerous spot. By taking manual control and flying onward to find a better site, Armstrong was committing to a longer descent, a greater consumption of fuel, and a race against the dwindling propellant supply. He was trading the certainty of a dangerous landing site for the uncertainty of a search that might or might not find a safe one before the fuel ran out. But Armstrong was not, by temperament, a man who panicked or who accepted a bad situation passively. He was the pilot who had stabilized the spinning Gemini 8, who had ejected from the exploding lunar landing trainer and returned to his desk. Confronted with a landing site that would destroy his spacecraft, he did what a test pilot does. He took control. With the boulders rushing toward him and the fuel burning down, Neil Armstrong took the Eagle in his own hands and began to fly, searching the lunar surface for a place where two men from Earth could safely land on the moon. What he did in the next 90 seconds would determine whether the first lunar landing ended in triumph or in catastrophe. The manner in which Armstrong took control reflected the sophisticated division of labor that the lunar module's designers had built into the spacecraft. He did not switch off the computer entirely and fly the vehicle by hand, in the way a pilot flies an aircraft. Instead, he used a semi-automatic mode in which he retained control over the horizontal movement and the attitude of the spacecraft, while the computer continued to manage the rate of descent. Armstrong could tilt the lunar module to fly it horizontally across the surface, searching for a landing site, while the computer held the descent under control. It was a partnership between man and machine, with the human providing the judgment that the machine lacked, the recognition of where it was safe to land, while the machine provided the precise control of the descent rate that would have been difficult for a human to manage alone. Armstrong tilted the Eagle to reduce its rate of descent and to fly it forward, across the boulder field and the crater, searching the surface ahead for a clear, level area. The lunar module, which from the outside appeared so ungainly, responded to his control. He flew it over the hazardous terrain, the boulders passing beneath, his eyes scanning the surface for a place to set down. This was flying of a kind that no one had ever done before. Armstrong was piloting a spacecraft across the surface of the moon at low altitude, searching for a landing site in real time, in a vehicle that had never before been flown to a lunar landing, over terrain that no human had ever seen at close range. The lunar module had been simulated, and Armstrong had trained in the flying bedstead, but no simulation could fully reproduce the experience of flying the actual spacecraft over the actual moon, with the actual fuel running down and the actual lives at stake. As Armstrong flew, Aldrin called out the critical data in a steady stream, reading the altitude and the velocity from the instruments so that Armstrong could keep his attention on the surface ahead. The recordings of the descent preserved this exchange. Aldrin's voice calling the numbers in the calm, clipped cadence of a trained professional. The altitude dropping, the forward velocity, the rate of descent. 750 feet coming down at 23, 600 feet down at 19, 400 feet down at 9. The numbers told the story of the descent, the spacecraft dropping toward the surface as Armstrong flew it forward in search of a clear spot. Aldrin's calls allowed Armstrong to fly by feel and by eye, watching the surface, while the precise data came to him through his crewmate's voice. It was a division of attention that allowed two men to do what one could not have done alone. The scene, reconstructed from the data and the recordings, was one of extraordinary human performance under pressure. Armstrong stood at the controls of the lunar module, flying it across the surface of the moon, his attention fixed on the terrain below, searching for a place to land. The boulders in the crater passed behind him as he flew onward, looking for clear ground. He was calm. The recordings of his voice during this period show none of the tension that had marked his query about the 1202 alarm. He had a problem to solve, the problem of finding a safe landing site, and he was solving it with the focused calm of a test pilot doing the most demanding work of his life. The man who had stabilized the spinning Gemini 8 and walked away from the exploding lunar landing trainer was now flying a spacecraft over the moon, and he was doing it with the same composure he had shown in those earlier crises. What made the performance so remarkable was that it was precisely the kind of thing that automation could not do, and that human judgment was uniquely suited to. The computer had been navigating to coordinates, and the coordinates were dangerous. Armstrong, looking out the window, could see what the computer could not, could recognize the boulders as hazards, could identify a clearer area ahead, and could fly the spacecraft toward it. This was human judgment operating in real time, integrating visual information, spatial reasoning, and piloting skill in a way that no computer of the era, and arguably no computer of the present day, could fully replicate. The first lunar landing, the supreme achievement of a program built on advanced technology, was at its most critical moment dependent not on the technology, but on the human being at the controls. The cost of the search, however, was fuel, and the fuel was running out. Every second that Armstrong flew the Eagle forward in search of a landing site consumed propellant from the descent stage, and the supply was finite and dwindling. The lunar module had been loaded with only enough fuel for the planned descent, with a modest reserve for contingencies. Armstrong's search for a clear landing site was consuming that reserve. In mission control, the controllers monitoring the fuel supply watched the quantity drop toward the level at which they would have to order an abort, the level at which there would no longer be enough fuel to land safely, and the only option would be to fire the ascent engine and return to orbit. As Armstrong flew on, searching for clear ground, the fuel gauge fell, and the moment approached when the search would have to end, one way or another. He had found the courage and the skill to take control. Now he had to find a place to land, and he had to find it before the fuel ran out. As Armstrong flew the Eagle across the lunar surface in search of a landing site, the fuel situation became the dominant concern in mission control. The controller responsible for monitoring the descent propellant was Bob Carlton, who watched the dwindling fuel supply and prepared to make the calls that would govern the final moments of the descent. The lunar module had no precise fuel gauge of the kind found in an automobile. Instead, the fuel quantity was estimated, and as it approached the critical level, the procedure called for Carlton to begin a countdown, announcing the time remaining until the fuel reached the level at which an abort would be mandatory. This level was known as the bingo fuel point, the moment at which there would no longer be enough propellant to complete a safe landing, and at which the only remaining option would be to abort, firing the ascent engine to climb away from the surface and return to orbit. The cruel arithmetic of the situation was that an abort itself required fuel and carried its own risks, and that aborting at very low altitude was particularly dangerous. The lunar module's descent and ascent stages were separate, and an abort required separating the ascent stage and firing its engine. Performing this maneuver close to the surface while descending was a hazardous operation that had never been tested in the actual lunar environment. The bingo fuel call was therefore not merely a point at which the landing became impossible. It was a point beyond which both landing and aborting became increasingly dangerous. Armstrong needed to land before reaching it, and the margin was vanishing. Carlton began the call-outs, and Charlie Duke relayed them to the crew. The first major call came as the fuel approached the critical zone. 60 seconds, Duke announced. It meant that Armstrong had 60 seconds of fuel remaining before the bingo point. 60 seconds to find a landing site and set the spacecraft down, or else abort. 60 seconds is not a long time in which to find a place to land on the surface of the moon while flying a spacecraft that has never been landed before, over terrain strewn with hazards, with the lives of 2 men and the success of a national effort hanging on the outcome. 60 seconds began to count down. Armstrong flew on. The recordings of his voice during this period are among the most studied in the history of spaceflight, precisely because they reveal so little tension. A man with 60 seconds of fuel remaining, searching for a place to land on the moon, might be expected to show some sign of strain. Armstrong showed almost none. He continued to scan the surface, continued to fly the spacecraft forward, continued to search for clear ground, with the same composure he had maintained throughout the descent. He had identified an area that appeared clearer, beyond the boulder field, and he was flying toward it, reducing his forward velocity, preparing to descend the final distance to the surface. He was working the problem, and he was not going to be rushed into a bad landing by the fuel countdown. He would land when he found a safe place to land, and not before, and he would trust his own judgment about how much time he had. The countdown continued. As the fuel dropped further, Carlton's calls grew more urgent, and Duke relayed them. 30 seconds, Duke announced. 30 seconds of fuel remaining. 30 seconds until the bingo point, until the mandatory abort, until the first lunar landing would either succeed or be called off at the final moment. In mission control, the tension had become almost unbearable. The controllers watched their data, listened to the fuel countdown, and waited, helpless to do anything but monitor, as Armstrong, 250,000 miles away, flew the spacecraft toward the surface with the fuel nearly gone. Gene Kranz, the flight director, would later describe the room as silent, the controllers barely breathing, every person in mission control aware that the next few seconds would decide everything. Around the world, the tension was shared by the largest audience in human history. An estimated 600 million people were following the descent, listening to the calm exchange of data between the spacecraft and the ground, hearing the fuel countdown, understanding that something was happening that had not been planned, that the landing was taking longer than expected, that the fuel was running low. The world held its breath. The calm voices of Aldrin calling the altitude and Duke relaying the fuel countdown carried a drama that needed no embellishment. 30 seconds of fuel. A spacecraft descending toward the moon. 2 men aboard. And the question that hung over everything. Would Armstrong find a place to land in time, or would the first attempt to land human beings on the moon end in an abort, or worse, in a crash, with the fuel exhausted and the spacecraft falling the final distance to the surface? Armstrong had found his spot. Beyond the boulder field, he had located a relatively clear, level area, and he was bringing the Eagle down toward it. The forward velocity was nearly arrested. The spacecraft was descending the final feet toward the surface. Aldrin called the data, the altitude dropping through the final tens of feet, the spacecraft drifting slowly as Armstrong nulled out the last of the horizontal movement. A cloud of lunar dust, kicked up by the descent engine's exhaust, began to blow across the surface, partially obscuring Armstrong's view of the ground. He flew through it, watching for the moment of contact, the fuel nearly gone, the surface just feet below. And then, on one of the spacecraft's legs, a sensor touched the lunar surface, and a light illuminated on the instrument panel. The light that illuminated on the instrument panel was the contact light, triggered by a probe extending from the footpads of the lunar module that touched the surface a moment before the legs themselves. Aldrin saw it and called it out. Contact light. It was the signal that the spacecraft had reached the surface of the moon. Armstrong shut down the descent engine, and the Eagle settled the final inches onto the lunar surface, its four legs taking the weight of the spacecraft, and came to rest. After 12 minutes of descent, after the alarms and the boulder field and the fuel countdown, the lunar module was down. 2 human beings were on the surface of the moon. For a moment, the crew went through the immediate post-landing checks, confirming the spacecraft's status, ensuring that there was no immediate need to abort and lift off again. Then Armstrong keyed his microphone and spoke the words that announced the achievement to the world. "Houston," he said, "Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The words were deliberate. Armstrong had given the landing site the name Tranquility Base, after the Sea of Tranquility in which it lay, and he used that name now to report that the landing was complete. The first human landing on another world had been accomplished, and Armstrong announced it with the same calm that had carried him through the descent. The response from Houston captured the emotion that Armstrong's calm had concealed. Charlie Duke, the capsule communicator, replied with words that became nearly as famous as Armstrong's announcement. "Roger, Tranquility," Duke said, momentarily stumbling over the unfamiliar call sign in his relief. "We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." The phrase captured the experience of mission control during the final moments of the descent. The controllers had been holding their breath, almost literally, as the fuel ran down and Armstrong searched for a landing site. They had been turning blue. And now, with the Eagle safely on the surface, they were breathing again. Duke's words, spoken in the rush of relief, conveyed the tension that the entire room had endured and the flood of relief that followed the landing. In mission control, the relief broke into something close to euphoria, though the controllers maintained the discipline required to continue monitoring the spacecraft. Gene Kranz, the flight director, found himself momentarily unable to speak, so overcome by the emotion of the moment that he had to gather himself before he could continue directing the mission. The controllers, many of them young men in their 20s and 30s, had just participated in the first landing of human beings on another world, and they had done it under conditions far more harrowing than anyone had anticipated. The descent that they had rehearsed hundreds of times had thrown crises at them that none of the rehearsals had included, and they had risen to those crises, and the Eagle was on the moon. The accumulated tension of the descent, and of the years of work that had led to it, broke over the room. The reality of how close the landing had come became apparent in the moments after touchdown. The fuel remaining when Armstrong shut down the engine has been the subject of analysis ever since, with estimates varying depending on the method of calculation. But the consensus is that the Eagle landed with somewhere between 17 and 25 seconds of fuel remaining before the mandatory abort point. The margin had been razor thin. Had Armstrong taken a little longer to find his landing site, had the boulder field extended a little further, had the fuel been consumed a little faster, the descent would have reached the bingo point, and the landing would have been aborted at the threshold of success, or worse. The first lunar landing had succeeded with seconds of fuel to spare. It had been by any measure an extraordinarily close thing. Perhaps the most revealing detail of the entire descent emerged only afterward, from the medical telemetry that had monitored Armstrong's vital signs throughout the landing. Armstrong's voice during the descent had been calm, controlled, betraying almost no tension even as the alarms sounded and the fuel ran down. But his heart told a different story. The medical data recorded Armstrong's heart rate rising to approximately 150 beats per minute during the final phase of the descent, roughly double his normal resting rate. The calm voice had concealed the strain that his body registered. Armstrong had not been unmoved by the danger. He had felt it, as his racing heart revealed, but he had not allowed it to affect his performance. He had kept his voice calm, his hands steady, and his judgment clear, while his heart raced at the edge of what the moment demanded. This was the essence of what made him the right man for the descent. He felt the fear, and he flew through it. The landing of the Eagle was the culmination of everything the American space program had built toward since Kennedy's commitment in 1961, and since the humiliation that had launched the program years before that. Two men were on the surface of the moon. They had arrived through a descent that had tested them and mission control to the limit, and they had succeeded because of a combination of human skill, thorough preparation, and the courage of a pilot who took control when the machine could not see the danger ahead. The hardest part was over. Several hours later, Armstrong would open the hatch, descend the ladder, and become the first human being to set foot on the moon, speaking the words that the entire world was waiting to hear. But the moment that had truly decided the success of the mission had already passed. It had passed in the 12 minutes of the descent, in the boulder field and the fuel countdown, in what Armstrong did when his lunar module was seconds from disaster. In the days and weeks after the landing, engineers analyzed the descent in detail to understand what had gone wrong and why the landing had come so close to failure. Two problems in particular demanded explanation. Why had the computer sounded the 1,202 and 1,201 alarms? And why had the automated guidance system carried the Eagle toward a boulder field rather than the smooth landing site the planners had intended? The answers revealed how narrow the margin had been and how many things had to go right in the moment to convert a near disaster into a triumph. The cause of the computer alarms was traced to the rendezvous radar, an instrument used during the rendezvous of the lunar module with the command module, a maneuver that would not occur until after the landing, when the ascent stage returned to orbit. During the descent, the rendezvous radar was not needed, but the checklist had called for a switch governing the rendezvous radar to be left in a particular position. And in that position, the radar was sending a continuous stream of data to the guidance computer, data that the computer did not need during the descent, but that it was nonetheless required to process. This unnecessary data consumed a significant fraction of the computer's processing capacity, and when combined with the demands of the descent itself, it pushed the computer beyond its capacity, triggering the overflow alarms. The computer was being asked to do more work than it could complete, because it was wasting effort processing radar data it did not need. The crucial point about this failure is that it could have been catastrophic but was not, because of the way the computer had been designed. A less sophisticated computer, overloaded in this way, might simply have stopped working, frozen, or produced erroneous guidance, any of which could have doomed the landing. The Apollo guidance computer, however, had been designed with a priority scheme that allowed it to manage overload gracefully. When it could not complete all of its tasks, it identified the most critical tasks, the guidance and navigation calculations essential to the descent, and completed those, while shedding the less critical tasks and restarting. The 1,202 alarm was the computer's way of reporting that it was doing this. The computer was not failing, it was protecting itself, shedding the unnecessary load, and continuing to perform the calculations that mattered. The brilliance of the computer's design, the priority scheme built in by its engineers at MIT, was what allowed the descent to continue through the alarms. The computer almost failed, and it did not, because it had been designed by people who understood that it might be overloaded and who built in the means to survive the overload. The second problem, the guidance toward the boulder field, had a different cause. During the descent, small errors had accumulated in the spacecraft's navigation, with the result that the Eagle arrived at the final approach phase slightly farther downrange than intended. The automated guidance system was carrying the spacecraft to the coordinates it had been given, but because of the navigation errors, those coordinates corresponded to a location several miles beyond the intended landing site, in terrain that turned out to be hazardous. One contributing factor was that the lunar module had undocked from the command module, with a small residual pressure that imparted a slight velocity, an effect that had not been fully accounted for and that nudged the trajectory. The accumulated errors were not large in absolute terms, but they were enough to shift the landing point from the smooth area the planners had selected to the boulder field that Armstrong confronted. The automated system was navigating accurately to the wrong place because the navigation itself had drifted. The combination of these two problems created the crisis of the descent. The computer alarms, caused by the rendezvous radar, consumed Armstrong's attention and raised the specter of an abort at the worst possible moment. The navigation drift, meanwhile, carried the spacecraft toward dangerous terrain. Either problem alone would have been serious. Together, they created a descent in which the crew had to manage repeated computer alarms, while also confronting a landing site strewn with boulders, all while the fuel ran down. It was a convergence of difficulties that no simulation had fully reproduced, and it pushed the crew and mission control to the limit. What converted this near disaster into a triumph was the combination of three things, each of which had to function for the landing to succeed. First, the intelligent design of the computer, which allowed it to survive the overload and continue providing guidance rather than failing outright. Second, the thorough preparation of mission control, which allowed Steve Bales and Jack Garman to recognize the alarms as survivable and to make the call to continue rather than aborting unnecessarily. And third, the skill and nerve of Armstrong, who recognized the boulder field, took manual control, and flew the spacecraft to a safe landing with seconds of fuel to spare. Remove any one of these three, and the landing fails. The computer's design, the ground team's preparation, and the pilot's skill combined to overcome a convergence of problems that might easily have ended the mission. This is the deeper truth of the Apollo 11 landing, and it is a truth that the popular memory of the event sometimes obscures. The landing is often remembered as a smooth triumph, the inevitable culmination of American technological superiority. It was not smooth. It was a near disaster, salvaged in the final minutes by the convergence of good design, thorough preparation, and human skill. The margin was seconds of fuel, the crisis was real, and the success was not inevitable. It was earned, in the moment, by people and machines performing at the very limit of their capabilities, in a descent that came far closer to failure than the triumphant images of the landing would ever suggest. The deepest meaning of the Apollo 11 descent lies in what it revealed about the relationship between human beings and the machines they build. The Apollo program was the most technologically advanced undertaking in human history to that point, a triumph of engineering, computing, and industrial organization. And yet, at its most critical moment, the moment of the first lunar landing, the technology faltered, and it was a human being who saved the mission. The computer overloaded, the automated guidance carried the spacecraft toward destruction, and Neil Armstrong, looking out the window with the judgment of an experienced pilot, took control and flew the spacecraft to safety. The supreme achievement of the machine age was salvaged, at the decisive instant, by the irreplaceable capabilities of a human being. This is not to diminish the technology. The technology was extraordinary, and without it, there would have been no descent to save. The Saturn V that carried the astronauts to the moon, the lunar module that descended to the surface, the guidance computer that, for all its limitations, navigated across 250,000 miles of space. All of these were achievements of engineering that made the lunar landing possible. And the computer's intelligent design, its ability to survive overload by prioritizing critical tasks, was itself a triumph of human foresight built into the machine. The technology was not the villain of the descent, but the technology, however advanced, had limitations, and those limitations became critical at the worst possible moment, and only a human being could compensate for them. Consider what the machine could not do. The automated guidance system could navigate to coordinates with precision, but it could not look out the window and recognize that those coordinates were dangerous. It could fly the spacecraft to a predetermined point, but it could not perceive that the predetermined point was a boulder field that would destroy the spacecraft. It had no eyes, no judgment, no capacity to assess a novel situation and respond to it. The computer could manage the descent, but it could not decide where it was safe to land. That decision required a kind of intelligence that the machine did not possess, the integrated visual and spatial judgment of an experienced pilot, the ability to take in a complex scene, recognize the hazards and the opportunities, and act. This is what Armstrong provided, and it is what the machine could not. The descent of Apollo 11 thus stands as one of the clearest demonstrations in history of the enduring importance of the human element. Even in the most automated of undertakings, there is a tendency, in an age of advancing automation, to imagine that machines will eventually render human judgment unnecessary, that sufficiently sophisticated systems will handle every situation without human intervention. The Apollo 11 descent suggests a more nuanced truth. The machine handled the routine aspects of the descent with a precision that no human could match, calculating trajectories and managing the descent rate. But when the situation departed from the routine, when the spacecraft confronted a hazard that had not been anticipated, it was the human being who recognized the problem and solved it. The machine excelled at the expected, the human excelled at the unexpected, and the unexpected is what nearly destroyed the mission. Armstrong himself was characteristically modest about his role. He tended to deflect attention from his own performance, emphasizing the contributions of the hundreds of thousands of people who had built the program and the equipment. He was right to do so. The landing was a collective achievement, and Armstrong's piloting was one element among many. But it was the decisive element at the decisive moment. The hundreds of thousands of people who built the program had created the possibility of the landing. Armstrong, in the final 12 minutes, converted that possibility into reality by doing what no one else could have done from where he stood, flying the spacecraft to safety when the automated systems would have flown it to destruction. There is a particular poignancy in the fact that Armstrong was a test pilot, because the test pilot represents precisely the human capability that the descent required. The profession of test pilot exists because machines, however well designed, behave in unexpected ways, and someone must be there to manage the unexpected, to recognize when something is wrong, and to respond with judgment and skill. Test pilots are trained to handle the situations that the designers did not anticipate, to keep flying when the machine misbehaves, to bring the aircraft home when something goes wrong. Armstrong had spent his career developing exactly this capability, and it was exactly this capability that the descent of Apollo 11 demanded. The first lunar landing succeeded because the man at the controls was a test pilot, trained and tempered to manage the unexpected, and the unexpected is what he faced. The lesson extends beyond spaceflight into the general relationship between human beings and the increasingly capable machines of the modern world. The machines are extraordinary, and they grow more capable every year. But the descent of Apollo 11 is a reminder that human judgment retains a value that automation, however advanced, has not yet replaced. When situations depart from the anticipated, when novel hazards appear, when the machine reaches the limits of its programming, it is human judgment that bridges the gap. Armstrong, standing in the Eagle with the alarms sounding and the boulders rushing toward him and the fuel running down, embodied this truth. He was the irreplaceable human element in the most technological achievement of his age. The machines took humanity to the moon. A human being landed them there. The numbers that describe the descent of Apollo 11 convey, in their precision, just how narrow the margin of success had been and how extraordinary the achievement was. The powered descent, from the ignition of the descent engine to the moment the Eagle touched the surface, lasted approximately 12.5 minutes. In that span, the lunar module slowed from an orbital velocity of approximately 3,700 miles per hour to zero and descended from an altitude of about 50,000 feet to the surface of the moon. Every second of that descent consumed fuel that could not be replaced, and the entire maneuver was a controlled race against the propellant supply. The computer alarms that nearly triggered an abort were the 1,202 and the closely related 1,201, both indications of executive overflow, the condition in which the guidance computer was overloaded beyond its capacity. The alarm sounded multiple times during the descent, beginning at an altitude of roughly 33,000 feet and recurring as the spacecraft descended. Each one required mission control to confirm that the descent could continue. The computer that triggered these alarms operated with approximately 70 kilobytes of memory and a processing speed that a modern smartphone exceeds by a factor of many thousand. That this primitive machine, overloaded and sounding alarms, nonetheless guided the spacecraft through the descent is a testament to the brilliance of its design. The fuel margin at landing has been the subject of careful analysis, and the figures convey the closeness of the outcome. When Armstrong shut down the descent engine at touchdown, the Eagle had somewhere between 17 and 25 seconds of fuel remaining before the mandatory abort point, depending on the method of calculation. The official call-outs during the descent had announced 60 seconds and then 30 seconds of fuel remaining, and the landing occurred shortly after the 30-second call. By any measure, the first lunar landing succeeded with less than half a minute of fuel to spare. Had the descent taken even a little longer, the mission would have reached the bingo fuel point, and Armstrong would have been forced to abort the landing at the threshold of success. The diversion that Armstrong's manual flying required is measured in the distance between the intended landing site and the actual one. The accumulated navigation errors had carried the Eagle several miles beyond the planned landing point, into the boulder field, and Armstrong's manual flight to find a clear site carried the spacecraft a further distance downrange. The Eagle ultimately landed approximately 4 miles from the originally targeted point. The manual search for a safe landing site, the flying that consumed the critical fuel, extended the descent and carried the spacecraft well beyond where it was supposed to come down, a measure of how far Armstrong had to fly to escape the hazardous terrain and find clear ground. The physiological data tells its own story of the strain. Armstrong's heart rate, normally low for a man of his fitness, rose to approximately 150 beats per minute during the final phase of the descent, roughly double his resting rate. This figure, recorded by the medical telemetry, reveals the physical toll of the descent on a man whose voice betrayed almost none of it. The calm that Armstrong projected was a discipline imposed over a body responding to extreme stress. His racing heart measured the danger that his voice concealed. The audience for the descent was the largest in human history to that point. An estimated 600 million people, roughly a sixth of the world's population at the time, followed the landing, listening to the exchange of data between the spacecraft and the ground. The descent was not televised with live images of the spacecraft, but the audio was broadcast, and the calm voices reporting the altitude and the fuel and the tense pauses conveyed the drama to a global audience that understood something extraordinary and dangerous was unfolding a 250,000 miles away. The spacecraft itself, the lunar module Eagle, weighed approximately 33,000 pounds fully fueled at the start of the descent, of which a large fraction was the descent propellant. The vehicle stood about 23 feet tall and spanned about 31 feet across its landing gear. It was, for all its fragility, a machine that performed its function, carrying 2 men to the surface of the moon, and later carrying them back to orbit. The descent stage that Armstrong flew to the surface remains on the moon today, at Tranquility Base, where it has stood for more than half a century. The lessons of the Apollo 11 descent were applied to the missions that followed, and the results demonstrate how much was learned. The 5 subsequent lunar landings, from Apollo 12 through Apollo 17, benefited from the experience of Apollo 11. Apollo 12, just 4 months later, landed with such precision that it touched down within walking distance of an unmanned probe that had landed on the Moon 2 years earlier, a demonstration of pinpoint landing capability that Apollo 11 had lacked. The navigation procedures were refined, the computer loading issues were understood and avoided, and the later descents, while never routine, did not face the convergence of crises that had nearly defeated Apollo 11. The first landing had been the hardest, the one that confronted the unknown, and the knowledge gained from it made the later landings more precise and more controlled. The final statistic is perhaps the most telling. Of the 12.5 minutes of the descent, the period of genuine crisis, from the first alarm through the boulder field and the fuel countdown to touchdown, lasted only a few minutes. In those few minutes, the success of an effort that had consumed 8 years, $25 billion, and the work of 400,000 people came down to the judgment and skill of one man at the controls of a spacecraft, with the fuel nearly gone and the surface of the Moon rushing up to meet him. The entire enterprise narrowed, at its climax, to those few minutes and that one man, and he did not fail. More than half a century after the Eagle settled onto the Sea of Tranquility, the 12 minutes of its descent remain among the most studied and most admired episodes in the history of human achievement. And they remain so because they capture something essential about what human beings are capable of at the limit. The descent was supposed to be the moment when technology delivered humanity to the Moon. It became instead the moment when a human being delivered technology to its goal, flying a faltering machine to safety through a convergence of crises that no one had fully anticipated. The story of those 12 minutes is the story of what preparation, training, and courage can accomplish when everything is on the line. What Armstrong did when his lunar module was seconds from crashing into the Moon was, at the simplest level, to keep flying. He did not freeze, he did not panic, he did not surrender the decision to the machine or to the fuel countdown. He recognized the danger, took control, and flew the spacecraft to a place where it could land, and he did it with a calm that concealed the racing of his own heart. It sounds simple, stated that way, and in a sense it was simple. But the simplicity is deceptive. To remain calm and to fly with precision while the alarms sounded. The boulders rushed toward you, the fuel ran out, and the eyes of 600 million people were upon you, all while standing in a fragile spacecraft on the surface of another world, is one of the most demanding feats of human performance ever required of anyone. Armstrong made it look simple because he was that good, and because he had prepared for that moment his entire life. The preparation is the part of the story that deserves emphasis, because it is the part that the legend of individual heroism can obscure. Armstrong did not save the descent through raw talent alone. He saved it because he was a test pilot who had spent years developing the judgment and skill the moment required. He saved it because he had survived the spinning Gemini 8 and the exploding lunar landing trainer, experiences that had tempered his composure under extreme pressure. And he saved it within a system of preparation that extended far beyond himself. The relentless training that Gene Kranz had demanded of mission control, the alarm codes that Jack Garman had memorized, the intelligent design that the computer's engineers had built in. The heroism of the descent was real, but it was a heroism made possible by preparation, by the years of disciplined work that had readied the people and the machines for the crisis that came. The lesson is not merely that Armstrong was brave. It is that courage, to be effective, must be married to preparation, and that the triumph of the descent was the triumph of a prepared man within a prepared system. There is, in Armstrong's own response to the acclaim that followed, a final lesson worth noting. Armstrong was famously reticent about his role, deflecting praise and emphasizing the collective nature of the achievement. He did not present himself as a hero who had single-handedly saved the mission. He spoke of the hundreds of thousands of people who had made the landing possible, of the team in mission control, of the engineers who had built the spacecraft. This modesty was not false. It reflected an accurate understanding of what the descent had been, a collective achievement in which his own role, however decisive, was one element among many. The man who had performed one of the great feats of piloting in human history was, characteristically, the last person to claim credit for it. His composure under pressure was matched by his humility in triumph, and the combination is part of what has made him an enduring figure. The deepest significance of the 12 minutes, however, may be the reassurance they offer about the place of human beings in a world of increasingly capable machines. We live in an age that often imagines the human element as something to be engineered away, a source of error to be eliminated by ever more sophisticated automation. The descent of Apollo 11 tells a different story. The most advanced machines of their age carried 2 men to the threshold of the moon, and then those machines reached the limit of what they could do, and a human being carried them the rest of the way. The judgment, the perception, the capacity to recognize a novel danger and respond to it with skill, these remained and remain distinctively human, and they made the difference between triumph and catastrophe at the most important moment. Armstrong's 12 minutes are a monument to the enduring value of human judgment, a reminder that even in our most technological achievements, there comes a moment when everything depends on a person, prepared and courageous, doing what only a person can do. The Eagle still rests at Tranquility Base, its descent stage standing on the lunar surface where Armstrong set it down with seconds of fuel to spare. It has stood there for more than 50 years, and it will stand there, in the airless stillness of the moon, for millions of years to come, long after the people who built it and the nation that sent it have passed into history. It is a monument to what human beings can do, and to what one human being did in 12 minutes, when the machine reached its limit and only a man could finish the journey. What Armstrong did when his lunar module was seconds from crashing into the moon was to fly it home, to a patch of clear ground on another world, and in doing so, he completed the greatest journey our species has ever made. If this account of the 12 most dangerous minutes in the history of spaceflight brought you closer to the reality of what it took to land on the moon, consider subscribing to Space Race Tales. Every week, we bring you the untold stories of the Cold War cosmos, the cosmonauts and astronauts who flew impossible missions, the engineers who built impossible machines, and the secrets that 2 superpowers spent decades hiding from the world. The space race did not end in 1972. The stories are only beginning to be told. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us for the next chapter.